We're not paranormal investigators. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's not what we do. We do academic research on a range of experiences, and everyone who works here has an advanced degree.
Today's guest is Marieta Pehlivanova, PhD. She's Research Assistant Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies.
I would call it a series of events or synchronicities that led to this opportunity in the end, and it's been a very exciting path, and I'm certainly very grateful to be here doing this work.
Dr. Pehlivanovanov's focus is on near-death experiences, children who report past life memories, and after-death communications.
So when Ryan was about 5, she reached out to Dr. Tucker and told him, so my son was, for the past year, he's been talking about Hollywood and how he used to live in Hollywood. And she got this book from the library that was about Hollywood, just sort of helping him process his feelings. And they were living in Oklahoma, very far away from Hollywood. And as they were going through this book, he found there was a picture from a movie that he pointed to that picture and said, hey, I used to work with that guy. That's George. He was an actor. And then he pointed to another guy in the picture and he said, that's me. And I found myself.
So now for my conversation with Dr. Marieta Pehlivanova. Hey, everyone. I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually, and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in the title. Hi, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Pehlivanova. She is Research Assistant Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine, Division of Perceptual Studies. So welcome. I'm thrilled to speak with you.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. As all of our listeners know, or the older listeners know, that the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia was absolutely key in getting me through my early days of grief. So I want to thank you for that. And, tell us a bit about what exactly is the Division of Perceptual Studies.
So the Division of Perceptual Studies is a research unit within the Psychiatry Department at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. And since 1967, so it was started almost 60 years ago, and it's dedicated to studying phenomena that may suggest the possibility that some aspect of human consciousness continues beyond physical death.
And I love the way you say that, because it makes it seem so believable, incredible, I guess is the word. So that was definitely that type of language and approach to this research I found so helpful, because it didn't have like the overly definite or flowery words that often can be associated, which to me, especially early on, made it all feel not real. So
right.
Definitely
so
appreciate.
We are clearly an academic research division, rather than, some people in that space might say, well, do my own research. We're not paranormal investigators. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's not what we do. We do academic research on a range of experiences, and everyone who works here has an advanced degree, either an MD or a PhD in a relative discipline like cognitive psychology or neuroscience, clinical psychology, etc. And we're all trained researchers and scientists who have gone through a lot of education and training to be able to do this work.
Yeah, very, very encouraging, and hopefully, drop in the bucket of changing the worldview on these topics. But what made you want to work for them? It's not really the typical field most of us go into.
That is true. It's not typical, although I would say more and more people are becoming interested in this. So for me, I guess the idea to be involved in this kind of work started, I would say, almost 20 years ago. It will be 20 years in 2026. And I just, at the time, I was still on my academic journey. I was studying statistics in undergrad and just basically getting a lot of tools, research tools. And I was interested in some of the phenomena that we study. And I had this insight at the time that we're sort of in this revolution that is happening where science is looking more into these phenomena, and there's more and more people who need that scientific perspective to take these experiences seriously. Now, of course, the landscape is very different than it was 20 years ago. I think we truly have a lot more societal interest in these topics. It's still something that's stigmatized and looked down upon by some academics, but I would argue that it's different than it was back then. And so I realized that I could use my academic scientific skills to apply to the study of these phenomena to understand them better. So this is how the idea originated. And after that, I had to get a lot more education, a lot more training to be in a position to have this job, including getting a PhD. My background is, so for my bachelor's, I studied statistics. After that, I worked as a biostatistician in the DC area with a network of hospitals. And that was a job where I learned a lot and it was interesting. And after a few years, I got sort of tired of it and always doing other people's, contributing to other people's research. And I went back to that idea of I really want to be involved in this work. Went ahead and got a PhD in experimental and cognitive psychology, which I decided is a good way to get involved in this work. And then toward the end of my graduate studies, I was aware of a few institutions where I could do the work that I do. And the Division of Perceptual Studies was one of these places. And then miraculously, things worked out. I mean, it's a long story, but there's a lot of different events and synchronicities, I guess you could say, that led to me eventually having this job.
I definitely want to ask you about that. But first, can I ask where your degrees are from?
Yes, my bachelor's degree is from American University in Washington, D.C., and then for graduate school, I went to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia.
Yeah, wonderful universities. So, yes, gives, again, all of this a lot of credibility. And yeah, that's a very intriguing line you said. So what are these synchronicities?
Well, that's almost its own separate podcast, but I guess one interesting aspect of this is where I knew about DOPS, and I also, separately from my studies and wanting to be involved in this research, I was also separately doing programs at the Monroe Institute. Now it's close to where I work, but I was going to that place for many years before I moved to Charlottesville. And for your audience who don't know, it's the Monroe Institute is this place where people go to using audio technology called binaural beats, and now they've expanded it to other technologies. But basically, it's sort of a meditation that helps you get into various altered states of consciousness. And actually 10 years ago today, this year, I went to this specific program on the intuition that I would meet someone important. And one of those possibilities was meeting someone who that would be important in my work path. And at that point, I was looking to make these connections. I was getting close to finishing my degree. And indeed, I went to that program, and that's where I met one of my colleagues who happened to work at DOPS and also had a connection with the Monroe Institute. He had a role in that program that I didn't know about. And that's how the connection was made. And from then on, I was able to visit DOPS, keep in touch with them as I was finishing my degree, and eventually they were able to find the funding to hire me. This is just one example of I would call it a series of events or synchronicities that led to this opportunity in the end. And it's been a very exciting path, and I'm certainly very grateful to be here doing this work.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you almost feel you were meant to work here if you
Well, I'm not going
believe
to say
that.
that, but it does. I feel, yes, for me and many of my colleagues, this truly feels like a life purpose kind of thing.
Yeah. And the research you have done and do, you mainly focus on near-death experiences and past life, children with past life memories, correct?
Yes, that is accurate. I do other
So,
things as well, but these are my main topics here.
well, let's start with near-death experiences. First of all, I think most of our listeners know what they are, but just, want to give a brief example of what one is, and then I'd love to hear about the research you've been working on with them.
Sure. So there's no clinical definition really of near-death experiences, but in general, these are experiences that are transformative, sometimes spiritual, that happen to some people when they're close to death, including clinical death and resuscitation, or even in some kind of medical crisis. And we define those experiences as having typical features, like people may report feeling disembodied, so they're watching down on their body. What's going on as medical personnel are trying to revive the body. People may report feelings of peace and great unconditional love, although some NDEs can be distressing. They may have encounters with various spiritual, mystical entities, deceased loved ones. They may talk about a life review where they see important events from their life up to this point and relive them, and not just from their perspective, but also from the perspective of other people who were involved in a given interaction, maybe even feeling the emotions or how of other people, how they were impacted by a certain interaction. People may also describe the experience as hyper vivid, hyper real, that their senses were more vivid than they ever have been. And there are other typical elements, but for research purposes, we typically give this questionnaire called the NDE Scale that was developed by Dr. Bruce Greyson, and it quantifies these different features. And if that score on the scale meets a certain threshold, then we decide for research purposes, we're going to consider this experience an NDE. That's the acronym we use for near-death experiences.
And what is some of the research, or maybe share your favorite research project you've been working on or have worked on
Um,
related to NDEs?
I don't have a favorite project per se, but I do have a favorite, not even a favorite theme, but something that I like to work on that brings me a lot of fulfillment. So just as a bit of background, there's been more than 5 decades of academic research on these experiences, and researchers have looked at all kinds of things. Again, what are these typical features? How do these experiences transform people? We know from the research that people can change their values, their worldviews, perspectives, sometimes in a very profound way, losing their fear of death, becoming, more compassionate, more focused on the well-being of other people. But even though a lot of that sounds very positive, people may also struggle a lot with processing the experience and how profound it was, and interpersonal difficulties that may arise if you've now come back and you're different, you've changed. People around you, there may be difficulties in how you relate to other people, how they relate back to you. And also research has looked at, the circumstances in which these experiences happen and what might be causing them and all of that. And to me, one thing that brings me a lot of fulfillment is to really think of how can we support these people who have these experiences. And again, the transformations, or at least some of them, may sound very positive. People also become more spiritual. They become, on average, convinced that life continues beyond death. But they may still struggle with how to process this profound experience. And so this is something that I like focusing on. I mean, I have a lot of different research projects related to NDEs, but that's the one topic that makes me feel like my work matters, that the sacrifices I've made to have this job and to continue to work here in various ways, that's the topic that makes me feel like, okay, it matters. Maybe we'll make a difference. And the theme is not just how do we support near-death experiencers, but also how do we change the culture in healthcare and even in society around people's experiences not being pathologized and people feeling free and comfortable to talk about this experience without being worried that other people will claim they're crazy.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there is a lot of dismissal of both these experiences and the research and the hope, or I don't ever use the word belief, but the assessment of the evidence that this is true. Or probable. There's unfortunately a lot of criticism, which definitely is not helpful to people. Is there a near-death experience that really stands out to you that blew you away the most?
Oh, that's really, I always struggle with this question because they're all, people's experiences are all so different. So I don't have a favorite one, I guess you could say, but if I look at individual NDs in terms of a feature that blows my mind the most is those experiences that have a very profound life review with a lot of a lot of insight about human relationships. So this is, for me personally, what moves me the most, because people from these profound life reviews, the people who have them, they report a deep learning of a lot of universal lessons about how we treat other people and how we should treat as we would like to be treated. So that's the stuff that typically moves me the most. Maybe that's different than an experience that blew my mind, but also sometimes, again, related to that human connection, sometimes people report encounters with deceased loved ones where there is some kind of forgiveness happening. Maybe it was some relative that you didn't have a great relationship with, or there was some harm or trauma, and then within the NDE there is some sort of healing happening, that person apologizing or gaining awareness of why that person did what they did, and how in the big picture it's all okay. and it's all as it should be.
Yeah, that's powerful. Yeah, it's very moving. And I'd love to get into some of your research of children with past life memories. That's actually the initial research of the Division of Perceptual Studies, right? Yeah.
Yes, that research is deeply tied to the history of DOPS. So originally, we were founded by Dr. Ian Stevenson, who's a psychiatrist, and at the time in the 60s, he was chair of our Department of Psychiatry, and he was just doing mainstream clinical research. But he had this interest throughout his life, really, into various metaphysical questions, and specifically at some point it turned into an interest in kids' past life memories. And so he did a few investigations in some Asian countries, and he found enough evidence or enough material to compel him to basically focus the rest of his career on just studying these cases. And that's when he started DOPS in 1967. And early on, most for the first couple of decades, the research was mostly on that, and then it sort of expanded to near-death experiences. And today we look at also out-of-body experiences, after-death communications. We also um, study some phenomena in a lab that could be experimentally manipulated. So our operation has grown a lot, and our team has grown a lot as well.
And what are some of the research projects or research project you'd like to share that you've worked on related to kids with past life memories?
So one interesting project I'll share is regarding what we call, or what in the literature was called, gender nonconformity. It basically is this phenomenon where, on average, the literature shows that, boys and girls tend to have, on average, not in every case, but on average, there's differences in preferences in for toys, um, playmates of the same gender, etc. And that's been sort of well documented in the literature over the last several decades. And we we did a paper. We wrote a paper at this point 7 years ago, where we looked at gender nonconformity among our big database of cases of children's past lives. Um, it was one we have that database has been curated over many decades, and we look at it. It codes for many different variables, but one of those is whether the child reports any gender nonconforming behaviors, and it may show up as relative to the culture and time, which is part of that definition of gender nonconformity, that the behavior, it has to be relative to the culture and the time. So we're talking about, in some cases, very traditional societies decades ago. Maybe the kid is dressing as, not, they're a girl, but they're dressing as a boy, or they're preferring to play with just boys. It's a range, and it could go all the way to them saying, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy, or vice versa. So that we have coding of that in the database. So we essentially published this paper showing that among children who recall a life of the same sex or same gender, which is the majority of our kids, very, very interesting that most kids talk about a life of the same gender, a past life of the same gender. So among these kids, that rate of gender nonconformity is pretty low. I think it was something like around 8%. But then if we look at these children who appear to talk about a past life of the opposite sex or the opposite gender, that rate of gender nonconformity goes up to, I think, 85% or something like that, which in statistical terms, this is a huge, huge effect size. And so we were able to publish that finding in a mainstream journal related to sexuality. And we thought that, it's an interesting finding. We're placing it in the mainstream literature of what's already known about gender nonconformity. There's genetic, environmental factors. And we're just saying, that's another factor that in some children may be a contributing factor. And, when we put out results like that, it's always important to be careful about how we present the data, how we interpret it, and not to make any big statements that are extrapolating beyond what the data says. So we're not saying that's the reason that some kids are trans, or we're not making any such claims, although I know some people read that may interpret it in this way. But um, to me, it's more of it presents some sort of evidence of how these past life memories, that they can play a very powerful role in the behavior and identity of some of these children.
Well, that is fascinating. And yeah, I guess it'd be way jumping to a conclusion to assume that leads to trans, but any bit of possible evidence that can, especially in this day and age, give more empathy and support and understanding to the trans community is great, if anyone does interpret it that way. But again, science versus human
Right.
ethics, or it can be not necessarily the same. But I just thought, given this day and age, that was important to throw in there. But I guess along those lines, I do have a question. Am I right that most of the children then tend to completely forget and cut off ties with their previous personality by a certain age? And I'm curious if the gender identification also falls into that.
Well, you know, it's it's maybe too strong of a statement to say that they cut ties. And what we normally find is that, on average, this among some children, not all children talk about past life memories, but the ones who do, usually they'll start between 2 and 3, which is fairly young, right? They have to be able to talk. Um, and then they stop, they may be very involved or not. Not every kid who talks about past life memory is very involved in them, but some of them are very involved. But regardless, they sort of seem to move on between the age of 5 and 7. And I don't call it forgetting the memories, because we don't know that that's what's going on. Um, it's more that they move on and stop talking about that. We did a study looking at um, children who have been investigated here by DOPS researchers, and then they grew up, they're now adults, and specifically American cases. So we were able to do a follow-up study. It was with a small sample, but we're working with a very small population. And the ones that we were able to find and the ones that were willing to talk to us, 3.5 decades later on average, so they're now adults, and we found that about half of them still remember something. So, and some of them actually had, I don't want to say vivid, but detailed memories of some of the stuff they had said in childhood. So that percentage of who remembers appears way higher than what we would have thought. Now, of course, it's quite possible, if not likely, that the sample is biased, because if it's biased toward the people who remember, because if they didn't remember anything, they're probably less likely to respond to us. Although we still got people who didn't remember anything but agreed to talk to us. Um, so from that study, we learned that most of these kids turn out to be normal or average adults who have not average in the sense of, I meant like people who just have a variety of jobs, they have families, they have normal lives like the rest of us. But we found that in some of them that they, were impacted by this phenomenon in early childhood. They may be more less fearful of death, or have this belief that life goes on after we die, so less worry about maybe if a relative dies, maybe having this perception that, oh, I'm going to see them again at some point.
And of the cases that you choose, or Division of Perceptual Studies chooses to take on, of reported past life memories, are there certain criteria? I would assume that tons of people probably reach out with claims of this.
Yes. So I'm glad you asked me that, and I'll tell you a little bit about how this process works. So we normally do not solicit these accounts. Parents find it, usually parents, sometimes it could be a grandmother, but most of the time it's the mom. And especially now with the internet, but also in the last year especially, there's been a lot more media interest in DOPS and the topics we study. The New York Times wrote about us, the Washington Post, several other big. There was also a documentary a few years ago on Netflix. So I think that's led to more public awareness. So it's easier to find us. And so the parents write to us and they might say, okay, my kid is saying this and that. And we have a trained research assistant whose entire job is to communicate with these parents. And we may want to reassure them, because sometimes the kids talk about distressing stuff, but also that a research assistant's job is to try to elicit specific details. So if the child is providing elaborate details, but nothing that would allow us to verify that against a deceased person's life. So if there's no names or not enough specifics to identify that person, then we can't do much with it in terms of doing a full investigation. The cases that we tend to be interested in are cases where, again, there's specific information, like the child says, this was my name, this is where I lived, these were the people around me, this was my job. So not necessarily all of these, but some combination of these. Also, if they could provide some kind of timeline of when this was going on. And also if there's some other interesting aspect to the case, like the child is maybe talking about or seems to have an understanding of a foreign language that they were never exposed to. So we just wrapped up a paper we have a wonderful postdoc, Saida Sadeghi, who joined us 4 months ago, and I'll be happy to tell you about the project that we're doing together. And
yes,
she and my colleague Philip Cozzolino and myself, it was led by her, but we're also part of it. She did an analysis of these initial parental reports that we have received since fall of 2018. So 7 years ago, basically every single account that we have received in the last 7 years, that is a child's report. Sometimes we hear about adults who are talking about their own past life memories, but we're talking about kids who are now kids. And she looked at 77 accounts. A lot of sevens. That's interesting. So we looked at things like what kinds of things does the child usually talk about? Commonly, they provide names, occupations. In a lot of the cases, there is something distressing about the case. So either they appear to have a memory of how that previous person died, or there may be something else distressing, like the kid is saying, I miss my previous family, or I miss my previous parents. And we also track parental distress. Some of these parents are just coming to us because they're sort of open-minded and curious about this. And at the other end, we do find that some parents are very distressed. They don't know what's going on. And so interestingly, what we found in this analysis is that there's two factors that seem to contribute to parental distress, and both of them make sense. One is if the child is talking about something overtly distressing and traumatic, the parent is also distressed, right? That is to be expected. And then the other thing we found is that the parents are likely to be distressed if the child is saying that I had other parents. You're not my real parents. I miss my other parents, which is something that we hear from some of these children.
Right. And that must be hard, I'm sure, for a parent to hear,
Yeah, I cannot imagine. Parenting is not, it's really not easy. And then on top of that, to deal with this unusual situation that most kids do not experience. But this goes back to this point. We need more awareness of these experiences. We need, in society, with parents, with healthcare professionals, with psychologists, pediatricians, in this case, we need to just spread the word. This happens with some children, and most of the time they seem to move on and just get on with their lives. Um, and maybe we need to, I don't know. It would be wonderful if parents can be supported. Now, we're not, because we're strictly a research institution, we're not really in a position to provide clinical support, but I will say that for many of these parents, even just knowing that someone is doing research on this phenomenon is very reassuring. And also, I have some other interesting bit of data. As part of that follow-up study, we also did a survey with parents of children who've been interviewed, which has not been published yet, but will be hopefully soon. And so these are fully investigated cases. So these are not just parents who contacted us, but parents whose cases were formally investigated. That's how they ended up in this big database. And we asked the parents at the end, how did you feel about that investigation? Was it positive, negative, neutral? And I think all but one said it was a very positive experience. And the reasons they gave was, we felt heard, we felt finally we're not crazy, that it was very validating for them to know that someone is taking their concerns and is taking the situation seriously. And also to know that there's other parents who are dealing with the same thing.
And I don't know if there's any data or even just you personally have noticed, is there a difference in any notable way of reports or cases, ways of investigation of people from cultures such as Eastern cultures that have a belief in reincarnation versus Western cultures where, people just don't ever believe in or think about reincarnation? If you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened. Well, that's in general a very, very interesting point. So as I mentioned originally, these investigations were primarily in Asian countries. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that it's quite easy to find, let's say you go to India, you go to Sri Lanka, mm-hmm. It's quite easy to find some of these cases there because there's a lot more, right? People talk about it. But that also, from a scientific standpoint, introduces concern, right? If there's more of this cultural buy-in into this idea of reincarnation, then maybe people are biased toward interpreting a children's
a child's statements as being proof of reincarnation. Maybe there's some sort of motivational aspect where the parent really wants that kid to be the reincarnation of so and so. And so, partly because of that criticism, the work later focused more, especially as led by Dr. Jim Tucker, who's our previous director. He just retired in January. So his entire focus was more on American cases. And it turned out that those cases also exist in the US and in other Western countries. And I guess he used to say that part of his reason for focusing on American cases that those cases would be more convincing to Americans, that they're more likely to be convinced of the reality of this phenomenon if it's from their own country and culture versus a foreign culture. But I think there's also, again, for scientific reasons and some criticism on this work, it's also important to show that this happens even in cultures that don't have this widespread belief in reincarnation.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, if we look at, there was a recent Pew Research study, I believe they do that every couple of years, but I think from 2024 or 2023, the statistics were that 31% of Americans believe in reincarnation, which is still pretty, it's still pretty high.
That's a lot of people.
It is
That's
a lot of
interesting.
people.
And how has the research evolved? Excuse me. How has the research evolved on cases of kids with past life memories since Dr. Ian Stevenson's
That
research?
is a great question that I'm very happy to answer because we have a lot of exciting stuff along these lines. So now I work closely with Dr. Philip Cozzolino. He's a social psychologist. So the two of us wrote this grant that got funded, and it's basically expanding the work on these cases in very exciting directions. So far, a lot of what we've done is these investigations of individual cases. So we get that kid, they talk, they're saying specific things, and then the investigator can go out there and interview the parent, interview the child, um, always trying to eliminate, is there some sort of conventional explanation of the child's statements? Could they have heard this from somewhere? um, Watched a movie or whatever. And then, as part of the investigation, there's this search for, is there a unique person who lived and died that seems to be matching the details of what the child is saying. And in many cases, we have found many such cases that we call solved cases. And so these investigations have also led to this big database where we can log in these. At this point, it's, I think, 2,254 cases, fully investigated, coding more than 200 variables, all kinds of information related to the kid, related to their statements, related to their previous personality. And from that database, we could look at a lot of trends in the data. That example from the gender nonconformity study is an example of looking at these different trends within the data set. So this is great, and we continue to do that. But we also now want to expand things and start asking different complementary questions, including why is it that some children appear to talk about past lives, but not all children do. And so we in this big study, we're looking at what factors may contribute to the manifestation of these memories among some children. And we have two main hypotheses that we're excited about. One of those has to do with memory processes, because that is something we can test in the lab. There's a lot of mainstream research on memory performance, and different kinds of memories too. And in particular, we're interested in what's called autobiographical memory, which is memory for events of your own life. So we have this very provocative hypothesis that some of these children maybe have extraordinary autobiographical memory that takes them to a previous life. And this is something that we can test in the lab. We can get a bunch of these children and we can compare them to on memory performance to children who are similar demographically but don't show past life memories. We're also looking at the effect of trauma, specifically. So the rationale there is a lot of these kids talk about traumatic, potentially traumatic stuff in up to 70% of the cases for which 65 to 70 of the cases for which we have information about how that previous person died, the death was not natural or sometimes even violent. And so that could bring a lot of distress to the kid, a lot of nightmares. So we're wondering, could there be some sort of, again, that's also provocative and out there maybe, can some of that trauma sort of transfer to the current life? And can we see, do some of these kids behave as if they're traumatized in the absence of traumatic exposure in this life? And so as part of this big expansion, we're going to be doing a lot of laboratory studies, including with neuroimaging, especially with various trauma paradigms. We could look at, at the brain of these kids and how their brains respond to threatening stimuli. There's a lot of mainstream literature that we're tapping into. And it's very exciting. We're also going to be doing this big family study where we want to learn more about the environment in which these memories manifest. What is the family like? What are the parental relationships like? We also want to ask the parents to report on traumatic exposure in the family. That's the adverse childhood experiences. That's something that's talked a lot about these days. So this is quite exciting because it's novel. It's never been done, but it is an important set of questions. And it's also exciting because it allows us where we want to engage more with these mainstream literatures. And as much as possible, we always try to publish our work in the psychology, mainstream psychology, neuroscience journals. And looking at some of these tasks and processes is hopefully going to help us do that. So this is the most exciting stuff that we've got going on with this research. We also have upcoming, well, the data has been collected, but we did this with Dr. Cozzolino. We did this study of the prevalence of this phenomenon in a nationally representative sample of 1,000 mothers. And we're asking about all of these different features. Has your child ever talked about having a different occupation, having a different family, having died before, things like that? And we haven't dug into the data yet, but it looks like the final answer will be a non-trivial percentage of moms have had their child say things like that. And we're hoping to get an answer to how common is this.
Well, I'm curious what that answer is when you have it.
Yeah, we're curious too.
Well, is there a case that you have either worked on, and if you don't have one that you've worked on, a historic one that just you consider the most mind-blowing or most veridical?
I haven't worked on trying to rebuild the pipeline with the resources after Dr. Tucker's departure. But one case we have two American cases that are very compelling. One is of James Leininger, who remembers being a World War II pilot, who died in battle. And then the other one is Ryan Hammons, who is a boy from Oklahoma, and he appeared to remember the life of this not well-known Hollywood actor. They're very different cases in terms of the elements. The Ryan Hammons case is interesting because a lot of what the kid has said had been documented by the mom before she reached out to Dr. Tucker. And the statements were documented while the kid was saying them, which is it's very nice. Like there's less of an opportunity for contamination. So when Ryan was about 5, she reached out to Dr. Tucker and told him, so my son was, for the past year, he's been talking about Hollywood and how he used to live in Hollywood. And she got this book from the library that was about Hollywood, just sort of helping him process his feelings. And they were living in Oklahoma, very far away from Hollywood. And as they were going through this book, he found there was a picture from a movie that he pointed to that picture and said, hey, I used to work with that guy. That's George. He was an actor. And then he pointed to another guy in the picture and he said, that's me. And I found myself. And so the mom, she learned more about that movie. She found that one of the actor that the kid had pointed to was the actor George Raft. And it was a movie from the 1930s. And so she was already verifying what the kid was saying, because the actor name was not labeled. Neither of the actors were labeled in that picture. But she was really struggling finding information about that other actor that the kid had said that he was. He was not well known. He didn't have a big role in the movie. So she was reaching out to Dr. Tucker to basically ask for help in identifying that other man. And so that's how he got involved in the case. But he wasn't able to solve that until he got help from someone who worked in the archives of the National Motion Picture Academy in Hollywood. And so that woman was able to identify this actor. His name was Marty Martin. This was way before there was anything about Marty Martin on the internet. Today, that he's listed as an actor in that movie, Night After Night, I think. And
it'd be interesting if it was Night After Life. That would be kind of apropos.
I guess I'm thinking about life and death. And so once that character was identified, they were able to get a lot of information about his life, including from his adult daughter, who was still alive at that point. She was, I believe, in her 50s. And they were able to verify a lot of what Ryan was saying about the life of Marty Martin, including the color of the car that he drove, having traveled to Paris, having had stepsons or being married many times, the street that he lived on, including very specific details about his relationship with his daughter, the age at which he got her a dog. This case is very interesting to me because it's one of the cases with the highest number of what we would call verified cases. It's also interesting because the kid is not talking about a distressing death, but he still had some distress, some serious distress that was linked to him missing that family that he remembered. And there's some other interesting details. In many cases, these kids start talking about past life memories as soon as they're able to talk. coherently, which is again between ages of 2 and 3. In the case of Ryan Hammons, the interesting thing is that he started speaking late, around the age of 4, because he had an issue with his tonsils that was basically messing up his apparatus. And as soon as they fixed that and he started speaking later than normal, he started talking about Marty Martin's life. So I will say, I mean, most cases, at least most American cases, they're not, most cases are not as strong as, and we keep looking for very compelling cases. I am of the belief that it's not another very compelling case or even 10 more compelling cases that will change people's minds, because there's already been a lot of compelling work. So I think we should still continue to pursue these cases and always be on the lookout of the next really impressive and strong case. But I don't think that that is specifically is what is going to change people's minds or move the work beyond what it's already been done. And it's important to add some new approaches and some new questions to our portfolio while still honoring and continuing the amazing work that has been done by Dr. Stevenson, Dr. Tucker, and all of the other collaborators and investigators they had in other countries.
What do you think will change people's minds?
You know, I try not to concern myself too much with individual people and how their minds could be changed, but ultimately we just have to keep doing the research that we do, trying to do good work. I think this field is under more scrutiny than a lot of other fields of research, and keep trying to publish in these mainstream outlets. I think importantly, we have to keep talking about this work and spreading the word. I think there's also, I don't want to say generational, but maybe there's also a cultural impact where I definitely feel like there's more openness in society and maybe even among some academics. I'm not saying we've arrived and there's no stigma and skepticism, but I think it's different than it was even 5 years ago. And we could speculate about why that is. I think maybe after COVID and death being a lot closer, a lot more prominent in people's awareness, maybe that has led to people contemplating these topics more. I think also now with a lot of interest in psychedelics, if you start looking at that, the mystical side of psychedelics leads straight to near-death experiences. So that, I think that is one pathway toward more openness. And also, not giving up and not being intimidated, and just we do what we do, and it speaks to some people. It's convincing, or at least mind-opening for some people, and we're going to continue doing this in the best way that we can.
And one thing that used to bother me a lot early on and in my early grief, and I get emails about this a lot, is if the research is so solid, and I was like living in terror for a couple of years, I was going to find the catch. And if it's as strong as it seems, why is this not absolutely all over every news outlet? And why are the skeptics and scientists not just transformed by this?
Well, first of all, back to the point I just made, I think that stuff is a lot more in the news than ever before, in the most wonderful way. I mean, that, and I'm happy about it, because we need, it's we've had, I mean, again, we've had the New York Times writing about us, the Washington Post. That study I mentioned on the support needs of near-death experiencers, we published that a few months ago, and I'm happy to say that there's been a lot of media interest on that. That paper is, again, talking about the experience of these people. It's not making a claim that these experiences are ontologically real, but it's interesting that 2 years ago people would have been afraid to touch that. Just actually a little anecdote from yesterday. I talked to this journalist about this study, and she said, "Oh, I saw the paper." I had assumed that she showed interest in it because of the press release we did about 2 months after the paper came out. But she said, "Oh, I saw this paper when it came out, and I really wanted to write on it, but I was afraid." And I told her, "Well, now there's all these other journalists who are talking about it and who learned about it from the press release." And she said, "Oh, I wish I would have written about it 2 months ago, but she literally told me she was afraid that people would say this is crazy." And
Right.
so I think things are changing and the media is talking about it more. As far as the skeptics, I am not in the head of most of these skeptics, but scientists are humans too, right? Sometimes we forget that everyone who is a human is a human, and it doesn't matter your training, your position in society. You know, people have biases and they have their own ways of thinking that sometimes they want to protect. And it seems to me, I'm just speculating here, but it seems to me that this work, not for everyone, but for some people, it may be threatening, even though it shouldn't be. I mean, if you've spent your entire career um, very entrenched in, if you've spent your entire career very entrenched in this physicalist perspective of the world, that all our entire experience and consciousness is just, you know, your neurons firing and it's entirely brain based, it must be very difficult to consider evidence that suggests that, well, sometimes people can have extremely vivid conscious perception when your brain seems to be impaired, right? I can imagine that for some people that could be threatening. I don't know what it would take. I don't know what it would take to change. I don't think we can change everyone's mind. And I've often said, you know, we're not trying to change the mind of people who are dogmatic about their beliefs. And there are scientists who are. Even though some like to say, well, we're not as dogmatic as the religious people, but at the ends, at the extremes of the spectrum, I would say the behavior is very similar, right? Um, we cannot really change the minds of these people, nor would we want to. It's more about maybe trying to speak to these people in the middle who are skeptical but open minded. And I do want to say, real skepticism is not a bad thing. You know, we want to be, especially with these big claims that maybe come out of our work, we want to be skeptical, but you also want to be open minded. It's, there are a lot of people that we call deniers or debunkers, which is different from just being skeptical. But ultimately, I go back to this point. We just, you know, we just do the best work that we can, and we don't, of course, we have to interact with people outside of our and with um, mainstream people or scientists who disagree with us, but we cannot concern ourselves too much with what will take to change their minds. I
Yeah,
don't know
I
if
think
that answers your question, but
it it does. I think starting,
that's
I
kind of
always,
how I feel. That's how I look at things as far as people who are not interested in our work. But you never know who will be interested. And I think there's a lot more, even among scientists,
Mm-hmm.
people who are open-minded and curious.
And a loss and grief can change your openness too. And I think one of the biggest eye openers for me was, I mean, when I started reading this, the first work was Dr. Jim Tucker. Yeah, I think one of the key mind changes for me was noticing that all the skeptics, I was trying to find everything to debunk Dr. Jim Tucker because I just couldn't really believe it. I wanted to, but I was going to have that nagging, I'm lying to myself. And all the criticism was addressed in the book, and it was clear they hadn't read that. And then some even openly said, of course, this isn't true. I haven't read it, and I was like, that was all the people saying it's not true. I hadn't even read it.
Well, I have an anecdote about this, which really stood out to me. It made a big impact on me. So in 2012, I was in graduate school,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a notable year in parapsychology because this paper came out by Daryl Bem, who was very well known social psychologist at Cornell, had been the chair of the psychology department at Cornell, very well respected. And he basically put out this paper on precognition, retrocognition, in a series of experiments showing small but very significant effects. And it was published in the flagship journal, basically, of social psychology. So that's why it got the attention of a lot of mainstream psychologists. So at the time, I was still taking classes, and a lot of professors were discussing this because it was so outrageous, right? How this guy is publishing in this really prestigious journal, and he's making these outrageous claims, and a lot of people were just very upset about it. And I had this one professor who, very interestingly, was a professor who focused on rationality,
Mm-hmm.
cognitive biases, and decision making. I'm not going to name him, but his entire research focus was on that, like how to be rational, how to think well. And he literally said in front of the class, I will never read that paper because it cannot possibly be real. And
Yeah.
I heard that, I just thought, wow. I mean, how could you say that? And it just, to me, it seemed like the most unscientific thing that you could say.
Yeah, I would agree. That's the
Um,
opposite of
and
science.
unfortunately, that is the thinking of a lot of people.
Yeah. And so I want to ask you it's one of our final questions. How likely do you think there is, first of all, that psi is true and that an afterlife is true? And has this changed since you began your research?
That question has a lot of, it's multifaceted, right? When we talk about psi, which phenomenon are we talking about? I
Do you want me
think
to say?
psi is real
Mm-hmm.
in the sense, like, if we just define psi as um, a transfer of information that doesn't seem to be mediated by our conventional senses. So maybe we get some information about the future or something going on elsewhere. These are just some examples. I think it's real, and I'm speaking here as not just based on my research, but also based on my personal experiences. Um, I mean, as philosophically as a scientist, I would say I don't know if I'm 100% sure of anything, just because I want to leave a little bit of room. Just my philosophical position is that we should always leave a little bit of room um, for information that we're not aware of or other data. So I think it's quite likely that it's real. If I'm speaking strictly from my personal experience, I will say I think it's real. Does that answer your question? Oh, and
It
then you asked
doesn't.
me about the afterlife.
Afterlife, yeah.
Well, to answer that question, again, I have to ask, well, what is the afterlife? Are we talking about, does it look a specific way, or are you asking if maybe consciousness continues beyond death?
Continuation of consciousness downloaded by a brain by some mechanism we don't understand instead of created by a brain
Yeah,
and
I
wiped
mean,
out.
I think there's some compelling evidence for that. For that one, I would probably put the likelihood slightly lower than other kinds of psi, but I think it's quite likely.
And did you think that going into this research, or has your mind changed based on your experiences and research?
Well, I already felt this way before I went into this research, which partially motivated my interest because I took this as important and real, and we need to understand it better. I would say now, having been in this field for 8 years, I think I have a better understanding of the evidence and um, the different implications. I don't know if my mind has changed. It's more just appreciating the variety of evidence. So as far as the afterlife, I think I would put the likelihood of that maybe lower than other kinds of psi, but I still think there's some strong evidence that it is likely how things work.
Hey, thank you so much. And lastly, where can our listeners find you, follow you, and find and follow Division of Perceptual Studies?
So I personally don't have professional social media yet, but the Division of Perceptual Studies has a very active Facebook group where we post lectures, research updates, podcasts from our various faculty. I also recommend signing up for our newsletter, which is somewhere on our website. Our website is www.uvadops.org, and you can subscribe to the newsletter. It goes out every month or two. So it's nothing, we're not going to spam you, but that also includes a lot of updates about interviews and papers, podcasts, conferences, and other news from DOPS, and I highly recommend it. Thank
Well,
you for
thank you.
having me.
Oh my God, thank you for coming on and thank you for the research you do. I know from the emails I get from my listeners and the messages that Division of Perceptual Studies and your work mean a lot to a lot of people. So I know I'm
Thank
speaking on
you.
behalf
And
of a
that
lot of
means a
us.
lot to me to know that people are interested, and we're happy to go on these podcasts to talk more about our work and spread the word about this important research. And
Thank
thank
you.
you for all the work that you do and curating these conversations.
Oh, thank you. Okay. To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, Reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFjusthappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?